As we start a new unit, I think it's really important that we realize how units 2 and 3 both lead to the developments in this unit, and how unit 3 is actually running parallel with unit 4. Both happened between 1450 and 1750. While the Ottomans, Safavids, Mughals, Qing, and Russians are expanding, European empires are expanding too, but across the Atlantic. So, how did we get here and why Europe? That's what we're going to explore in this episode. European geography and the historical situation or context play a huge role in why the Europeans sought out new opportunities across the narrow sea. Oh, wait, that's Game of Thrones, not history. Never mind. I meant across the Atlantic Ocean. First, we're going to talk about the technology that allowed for this to happen. Then we'll talk more about the context. The cross-cultural exchange we talked about in Unit 2, where Europeans were beneficiaries of technological developments from East Asia and the Indian Ocean basin, played a critical role in giving the Europeans the navigational technologies they needed to be ocean-faring. New designs of the astrolabe, improved astronomical and navigational charts, and the magnetic compass were all adopted, and new ship designs were too. In Portugal, they adopted the caravel, a small, highly maneuverable sailing ship to explore down the coast of West Africa. Caravels were equipped with a lateen sail from the Indian Ocean and had a shallow draft, so it was easy for them to explore coasts and go up rivers. The development of the caravel was an example of the role that European states played in sponsoring new technology and exploration. Tony the Navigator of Portugal sponsored a school of navigation and technology at Sagres, and it was here that the major inspirations for the centuries of Iberian exploration took root. Another new ship design that revolutionized trade for Europeans was the Dutch flute. Like the caravel, the flute was designed primarily for trade and not for war, but even more so. Because it didn't need to be able to house cannons and the crew to man those cannons, it contained a lot more room for cargo, and like the caravel, it had a shallow draft, enabling it to get into shallow ports and dock with ease. This made the Dutch expert sailors and merchants, greatly increasing Dutch shares of world trade. So why is everyone all of a sudden interested in world trade? Everyone in Europe, anyway. To put it way back into context, you might remember that the Europeans in Unit 1 were experiencing limited and local trade in their decentralized and feudal system. But in Unit 2, the plague basically destroyed the feudal system and paved the way for a new, more mercantile and active Europe. As European monarchs and other elites sought out more luxury goods from the trade routes of Eurasia, and as a middle class of merchants arose to fulfill those needs, Europeans found themselves trading with the Byzantine Empire, which sits on the border between the metaphorical east of Asia and everything exotic, and the west of Europe and everything familiar and Christian. Then, in 1453, the Ottoman Empire destroyed the Byzantine Empire, and the Europeans then were forced to trade with the Muslims, something they didn't necessarily want to do or feel okay doing. Therefore, Europeans needed to find a new way to access the money markets of the East. This means that the new and powerful centralized monarchies we talked about last unit are going to have to support these missions or risk them failing. I already discussed one way that European monarchs could support exploration by coughing up the money for a school to study it and train navigators. But what else could they do? Well, most of it still involves funding and some official support. Because the Portuguese had this fancy school of navigation, they were the first Europeans to explore the coast of West Africa and set up trading relationships with the kingdoms there. Continuing down the coast, they were the first Europeans to sail into the Indian Ocean, where they immediately begin using their cannons to establish a trading post empire and bully their way into dominance. Despite their eventual hegemony on the Indian Ocean, when Vasco da Gama first met the Mughal emperor, the Mughals were extremely unimpressed by Europeans as a whole. It's quite the reversal. Spain, meanwhile, was a little busy at the time. It had been united by the marriage of Ferdinand and Isabella, and together they set out to reconquer all of Spain and wrest it from the Moorish kingdoms of the Muslims in the south. This, to them, was essentially a crusade. And when they were successful in defeating the Muslim kingdom of Al-Andalus in 1492, calling it the Reconquista, they decided that they would be willing to fund other promising ventures to create more Christian lands as well. Enter Christopher Columbus. After multiple attempts with multiple sovereigns to convince someone to fund his idea to pave a trade route to the west, Columbus happened upon Ferdinand and Isabella just at their greatest moment of enthusiasm for creating Christians. After their advisors tried to convince them of the folly of this plan, Ferdinand and Isabella allowed a small amount of funds to see what would happen. Columbus sailed a team of 3 caravels to the west, and well, the rest is history. History that we'll talk about soon. The Northern European monarchies also wanted to get in on the action once Columbus's missions came back semi-successful. This really speaks to one of the other factors that drove European exploration, the competitive nature of the European state system and the monarchs themselves who ruled it. Always trying to one-up each other, Europeans experienced a driving set of rivalries that weren't really present elsewhere. But back to the Northern European monarchies. England funded a few voyages across the North Atlantic, most notably those of John Cabot, who is actually Italian, and France sponsored Jacques Cartier, both looking for a northwest passage to preempt whatever the Spanish were doing in the Caribbean. Most interesting of all of this is why it was Europe who ended up doing all the exploring. They didn't have a rich history of sailing far. They didn't have the history with the technology or the trade or the interactions. So what happened here? Mostly, we have their geography, isolated from the real action in the Indian Ocean and a lot closer to the Atlantic coast of North America than the others. So it was really probably only a matter of time. But why didn't China reach the Pacific or even try? Some historians have postulated that they did. In the early 1400s, the Ming Dynasty, particularly the Emperor Yongle, sponsored a series of exploratory tribute missions around the Indian Ocean, led by his admiral Zheng He. Zheng He's fleet of over 300 ships and nearly 28,000 crewmen paraded giant treasure ships in several missions to assert Chinese dominance and prestige, bringing back tribute and allegiance from states around the Indian Ocean. These trips, though, were not exploratory. The Indian Ocean world was known to the Chinese. Maybe the purpose of these voyages would have changed if the Yongle emperor who had funded them hadn't died in 1424. And the following emperors decided that not only were these voyages expensive, but also immoral and against Chinese custom. One historian, Gavin Menzies, has theorized that Zheng He did in fact make it to the Pacific coast of North America, citing evidence of Chinese jade and coins that date to before European arrival. But he's basically the only one who supports that idea. It seems that the Chinese became increasingly isolationist, reverting to an extreme fear of foreign influence and seeking to double down on Chinese identity by interacting with the world as little as possible, probably as a delayed anti-Mongol reaction. So when we ask ourselves the question, why Europe, why not China, for the first but not the last time this year, context is more important than ever. The timing was just right for Europe, emerging from the plague, interacting more with the Eurasian trading network, avoiding the Muslim conquest of the Middle East, growing the centralization of power and money, and stepping into the vacuum left by China's exit from the world stage.